Hello, my name's Sophie. I'm Sophie Rack. I'm a sexual assault counsellor from CASA Forum, which is a peak body that deals with sexual assault. The Victorian Centres Against Sexual Assault are located across Victoria, and we work towards the elimination of sexual assault and sexual violence in our community. So this is a supplementary training session for all frontline clinicians, and it expands on the Strengthening Hospitals Response to Family Violence Modules 1 and 2, which acknowledge that sexual assault is an aspect of family violence and a model of sensitive practice was explained. This module assumes that participants have already completed modules 1 and 2. So this session is to help you as a health worker to be empowered with knowledge and ways to support people who have experienced sexual assault and sexual abuse. And given the prevalence of that, many of us will have been affected in some way, directly or indirectly. So it's important that as you're watching this and as you're listening, just being mindful of yourself and taking care of yourself in any way you need to. And so feeling free to take a break, have some water, stretch your body, and also for the rest of us, not assuming that if someone wants to take a break or leave the room, that doesn't mean that they've actually been personally affected. So let's talk about what we're going to speak about in the session today. So here's just a summary. We're going to talk about the definition of sexual assault, look at consent and the prevalence and facts about sexual assault, and then move on to responding to disclosures, rights, options and control, and then healing and recovery and support and referral options. So what is sexual assault? Sexual assault is any behaviour that is sexual in nature, unwanted, and makes a person feel uncomfortable, frightened or threatened. This is actually a CASA definition of sexual assault. The legal definition is slightly less broad, I should say, in the sense that the CASA definition takes into account all behaviours of a sexual nature that make someone feel uncomfortable, where the legal definition incorporates aspects that are prosecutable by law. So that includes rape, incest, child abuse, unwanted sexual behaviour, and includes watching pornography or masturbation, those sorts of things. So that definition can be found on the Victorian Legal Aid website. The main thing to focus on is that there are people who have experienced sexual abuse or sexual assault have medical and emotional needs that need to be taken care of, rather than trying to get your head around the legal definitions. The main thing is, how does the patient feel? Do they feel like they've been affected in a way that they would define that as something uncomfortable or unwanted, or they've felt under threat? It can happen to anybody, anywhere. It can happen in marriage, in family, people of all ages, genders and backgrounds, and to people of any sort of cultural background. So it's really important not to assume that someone may or may not have experienced it, just to be aware of some of the indicators to be aware of. For human beings, as humans, we all have a similar human experience. So it's important to remember that people never provoke a sexual assault, they're never to blame, and they're never responsible for the sexual assault. So now we're going to watch a video which talks about consent, and talks about consent being more than just getting a yes. It's about free agreement. So let's watch this video now.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Oh my God, I would love a cup of tea, thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you could make them a cup of tea, or not, but be aware they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important part, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you are entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say no thank you, then don't make them tea. At all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, yes, please, that's kind of you. And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time that it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind. And you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they're unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea. And they can't answer the question, do you want tea? Because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea. And they said yes. But in the time it took you to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down. Make sure the unconscious person is safe. And this is the important part again. Don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they're safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it going, but you wanted tea last week. Or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat going, but you wanted tea last night. But if you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you're able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand it when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to go make myself a cup of tea.
Okay, so what did we think of that video? I think it makes things really clear. Rather than oversimplifying it, it talks about the ideas of consent, and it's something that can be really useful to just help us understand that sexual assault happens when there's no free agreement. So it's about understanding that someone must be able to give free agreement to be able to consent to any sexual activity. It doesn't only happen because someone doesn't say no. It can be that they weren't actually able to freely consent. So the law talks about that if someone isn't able to consent because they are feeling under threat of harm to themselves or somebody else, that they're unlawfully detained, if they're asleep, or as you saw on the video, if they're unconscious or significantly affected by alcohol or other drugs, they're actually unable to consent. So it's important to think that if you have a patient who has been substance affected, that they may not have been able to consent at that time. The patient may not understand that themselves, so it's important for you to be aware of that. Also, sometimes people aren't able to understand the sexual nature of the act, and commonly with people who have a disability, they may not understand the sexual nature of the act. They may be mistaken about the sexual nature of the act or the identity of the person, or mistakenly believe that it's for medical or hygienic purposes. And certainly there are a lot of clients who come to our service who have experienced sexual assault within a medical setting. So we're going to talk more about, a little later, about how that can be a factor in people's presentation at health settings. So it's really important that to remember as well that within intimate partnerships, and where you may think that someone is a victim of family violence, that quite often sexual assault is an aspect of that, as people may not be able to consent within that relationship due to a number of relational factors. Being married or in an intimate partnership does not imply consent, and that's the really important aspect of this. So it's about thinking about whether someone has felt that they were able to consent, and they themselves might not be able to recognise that. The law in Victoria sets clear age limits for when you can legally consent to have sex. This is called the age of consent. So a person can be charged with a sexual offence if they perform an act that breaks these age limits, even if the younger person agrees to it. And these laws are really about power differential. So under 12 years old, no one can actually perform a sexual act with a child. Between 12 and 15, they must be within 2 calendar years. So from 12 to 14, or 15 down to 13, or 15 to 17. That's considered within the boundaries of the law, because young people are considered within that age bracket to have a similar sense of power and control, and so they are able to consent in full knowledge, usually, of what they're doing. Between 16 and 17 years old, the person, if someone isn't able to have sex with someone of that age, if they're in a caring role or supervising them in some sense, and that's also about the power differential, that that person is in a position of power and therefore might have some influence on the younger person. So if you believe that a child is in immediate danger, you must consult with police or the Victorian Forensic Medical Service. It's also important that you can consult with your local CASA, and we're going to talk about that further later on. Let's talk about prevalence. In terms of prevalence of sexual assault, the ABS is continually doing studies on this and gathering data, and so at the latest gathering of information, 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 6 boys were sexually assaulted by the age of 15, which is quite a sobering number. And actually what that means is that a number of the patients that you see are going to have experienced sexual assault in childhood, if not in adulthood as well. And patients of all genders and ages may have experienced this. So it's important to remember that even if someone isn't presenting with a current sexual assault, they may have experienced it in childhood, and they may be experiencing the results of that right now in their current presentation, or if they've had have a current trauma happening or family violence that doesn't involve sexual assault, it may be triggering past sexual assault for them. So you can see from these statistics that also 1 in 5 women and 1 in 22 men have been sexually assaulted after the age of 15. So it's an act of gender-based violence, and it's important to remember that it happens to people of all genders, but mostly it is perpetrated by men against women and children. National crime statistics showed there were 5 times as many female victims of family violence-related sexual assault as male victims. The person of concern is rarely a stranger, and often someone that the person knows and trusts, and often within the family. So it's also possible that a patient may never have disclosed their childhood sexual assault, and they may do so years after the event, and they may actually do so while they're with you in the medical setting. So now we're going to talk about some misconceptions and myths about sexual assault, which often shift responsibility and blame from the perpetrator to the victim. So let's stop for a moment and for you guys to call out some common beliefs about sexual assault, and let's write them on the whiteboard. What did you come up with? Let's see if you came up with some of the same ones we did. So quite common myths that we see still active in community today are that he didn't physically hurt her, that perpetrators are strangers, children lie about incest and sexual assault, women ask for it wearing clothes like that, and that men can't be sexually assaulted. These are myths that are still common in our society. They work to blame victims and excuse perpetrators, and allow excuses such as anger, substance abuse, or lack of control to minimise those kind of behaviours. Because of this, victims are often reluctant to report for fear of blame, or the sort of the myths that are surrounding them, the sort of responses that they might get from other people, whether it's family or whether it's the police or whether it's people that they tell that they're going to have a response. And a lot of these myths are actually internalised into the way that we think about sexual assault. So it's important to think about what your beliefs are around it, and just to be aware of those so that they don't impact when someone actually feels like they can disclose to you. So it's important to remember that perpetrators are usually known and trusted by the victims, so quite often sexual assault happens within the context of family violence. 97% of perpetrators are men. That doesn't mean that women don't sexually assault, they do as well, but by far it is a gender-based act of violence. They look and act like ordinary men, that it's across all sort of socioeconomic classes, incomes, races, ages, and often they act strategically in secret and use threats and coercion to get away with the crime. Most often it's perpetrated within the home of the victim survivor, and it's an underreported crime. It's under-investigated, it's under-convicted, and some of the barriers to being able to disclose are going to be discussed a little bit later. It's usually men abusing a position of trust and authority and power against women and children. So let's talk about impacts. This is important to keep in mind in terms of the patients that you're seeing, because they may be experiencing these impacts, and this can be a way that you can start to become aware of the potential that someone has experienced trauma and respond sensitively. So some of the impacts are emotional and psychological. Trauma is something that impacts functioning in daily life, so it can impact through sleep disturbance, depression, self-harm, nightmares, PTSD, which is a post-traumatic stress response. Sexual assault is a trauma, and so people quite often will have post-traumatic stress responses. So other aspects may be suicidality or substance abuse, lack of motivation, anger, rage, shame. These are some of the things you might see in your interactions with people, that they might be displaying an emotional or psychological response that is related to past trauma. They can also have social and intimate family relationships affected, a lack of trust in partners, parenting issues, isolation, blurring of boundaries. They may tell you too much in a session, or they may tell you not enough while you're doing your medical care. They may not be able to answer questions. Their physical health could be affected. They could have physical injuries that may never have been addressed that are related to the trauma. They may have difficulty disclosing about certain physical injuries or problems because of aspects of shame. They can have gynecological disorders. They can be pregnant as a result of a sexual assault. So it's important to keep in mind that those sort of aspects may be impacting their medical presentation. Legal, there can be criminal charges as a result of sexual assault, and we have clients who face criminal charges because of actions they've taken in terms of the impact of trauma on their life, that they might have needed to turn to crime as a result of their trauma and the way that they're living their life. Quite often victim survivors have a mistrust of police because of aspects that they might have had depending on their life, and they might have had situations where police weren't able to respond to them in a positive way, so they might not feel able to report to police. They can have housing concerns, homelessness, concerns about safety, whether their home is safe enough, whether the perpetrator is aware of where they live. So all of these things impact on their daily functioning. Financial aspects can be to do with if they have sexual assault within an intimate partner relationship. Control of finances is something that often is a part of that. And often people who've experienced trauma have difficulty concentrating. This is one of the post-traumatic stress responses. So they might not be able to sustain work or study. Their sleep might be impacted. All of these things can have a flow-on effect. So let's talk about some barriers to disclosure. The majority of victims who've been sexually assaulted don't actually report the incident to police. People are often reluctant to report for the reasons that we talked about before: fear of blame, fear of the justice system, and the negative stereotypes surrounding sexual assault. So, why do you think that sexual assault is often undisclosed and underreported? What are some of the attitudes that you've heard? Maybe take a moment to call out a few of these attitudes. And let's talk about some of those barriers. So one of the main things, as we talked about before, about the myths that still surround us in our society, society's attitudes to sexual assault blame victims and excuse perpetrators. They minimise the impacts and they minimise sexual assault happening in our society. The other main aspect is shame and internalised beliefs. So people find it really difficult to talk about sexual assault. It's an uncomfortable thing to talk about, and people's internalised beliefs include things like, nobody will believe me, I must be crazy, it's my fault, I must be weak, it's too shameful to talk about. And they often believe that they're going to be held responsible for the sexual assault, that they did something, that they wore the wrong thing, that they did the wrong thing, that they were out drinking, or that as a child that they somehow encouraged the perpetrator. And that's where we see offender behaviour, where they threaten and bribe and make promises that make it difficult for victims of sexual assault to put the blame on them, because offenders are actually avoiding blame. So they're going to say and do whatever it is that they need to do to get away with what they're trying to do. In addition to these, there's some specific populations who have further barriers to feeling able to disclose. Specifically for men, they find it particularly difficult because there's that extra barrier for men around sexual assault and normalising that. A lot of people still believe that men and boys aren't sexually assaulted. Men have added layers of shame around this because there's other myths specific to male sexually assault, including that men who are sexually assaulted must be gay, or they will go on to perpetrate sexual assault is something that we hear a lot from victim survivors, that they have a fear that they are going to become perpetrators, which is simply not true. There are many men who are sexually assaulted who actually understand the impact of that, and they will not go on to perpetrate sexual assault, and they're breaking that cycle. Men find it harder to talk about sexual assault. The other populations who find it hard to talk about, even harder to talk about sexual assault, they face more barriers, are women who are refugees or seeking asylum. There is cultural shame, further cultural shame around sexual assault. They may be blamed, seen as violated or dirty. Some women experienced female genital mutilation. There are many countries where that occurs. That's something where the World Health Organization talks about. They're trying to raise awareness around female genital mutilation, because a lot of that happens in situations where girls and women are not able to freely consent to that. And so therefore, some of the women that you might see might have experienced that, and they may not be aware that that's something where they weren't able to consent. Not to say that you need to raise that with them, but just to be aware. And if you want more information about that, then you can look on the Women's Health West website. They have a lot of information about female genital mutilation. Another community that find it exceedingly difficult to disclose are Indigenous Australians. They have individual and community shame that makes it even harder for them to disclose. Confidentiality is a key issue in those communities, and also they have a deeply embedded fear of police and authorities because of their experiences with those authority figures in their community. Also, children from Indigenous populations might find it especially difficult to disclose because of fear of removal, which is a very real factor, and the intergenerational trauma has had such an impact on that community that it is really difficult for them to be able to disclose. So it just calls for added sensitivity when you're working with people from those populations. Also, one final population I want to talk about are people from a rural context where they've come in to have their medical needs addressed. Confidentiality and anonymity is also a big issue in those communities because of the tight-knit communities. There's a lot of people who will in the community who will know the perpetrator, or the police may know the perpetrator, or you as the medical professional may know the perpetrator. So someone may have even more difficulty disclosing. As health professionals, we need to be really aware of those barriers. Let's talk about some events that might trigger reminders or disclosures of past sexual assault. So, various situations may trigger traumatic memories, reminders, or result in disclosures of past or recent sexual assault or family violence. Often people accessing healthcare may have just experienced a traumatic event, so there may have been a car accident, a bushfire, some other traumatic event, and current or recent traumatic events can trigger past memories. There may be things that have been buried, they may have been things that have never been talked about before. That's the way that trauma operates, that it sort of, it compacts together, and the experience of trauma in the body can remind the body of past experiences of trauma. They can be reminded of not being in control, not having body autonomy, and that's where we see in pregnancy that can be a trigger for some people. Health issues and medical appointments, like we talked about, can trigger memories because people may not feel like they're in control and they are coming to see someone who is going to look at their body, potentially touch their body, examine their body. So it's really important to keep that in mind and be respectful in terms of the ways that you approach people. In pregnancy, those examinations can feel quite intrusive if someone has had an experience of sexual assault. So it's really important to keep that in mind. Media reports relating to sexual assault, the recent Royal Commission, all of those things can trigger reminders, and that can be something that's really present for people when they come and see you in a hospital environment. Health issues can be related to sexual assault, and they may never have addressed those before. So it's important to remember the person may feel like that experience or that past trauma maybe feel to the body like it's happening now. So that's why it's important to really think about sensitive inquiry and effective support. These are some principles for responding to disclosures of sexual assault. It's important to listen actively, to believe, to verbalise that you believe the person. Some people have never disclosed sexual assault before, so a first response is really important to believe and listen and place the blame with the perpetrator rather than the victim, and validate and normalise their responses. We see in our work that first response that someone has if they've never disclosed before, or sometimes people have disclosed and not been believed, and they haven't disclosed again for a long time. So it's really essential to be able to do that. If you notice the signs, it's really important, even if the person hasn't disclosed, to act as if they may have had an experience of trauma and to treat them with sensitivity, as per the ways that we talked about in Module 2. We're going to talk a little bit more later about some of the things that you can say. Let's talk about a case study now. We're going to use this case study to further explore how to respond sensitively. So take a moment to read through this case study, and then we'll talk more about it. So what is sensitive practice? Do you remember the aim of sensitive practice from Module 2? Maybe take a moment to think about what some of the aims of sensitive practice were. So the primary goal is to make patients and families feel safe, respected, and in control, and create a safe and private environment before making any kind of sensitive inquiry. And then also listening, believing and validating in a non-judgmental way. Those things are all key to sensitive practice, and people are more likely to disclose sexual assault and family violence if they're feeling in a supportive environment, in a trusted environment, and feeling safe to be able to do so. So it's not actually your role to make people disclose or have them feel like they have to disclose, but really just to create a safe environment so that if the time is right and they feel like they want to disclose to you, that they feel able to do so. So a key element is the feeling of loss of control in sexual assault. So mainly what we're wanting is for people to be able to take control, to feel like their wishes are respected. So coming back to the case study and talking about Selma, what stands out in that case study for you? What stands out in her presentation? And what are some of the signs that make you think, any clues that make you think that sexual assault or family violence may be an aspect of her presentation, maybe something she's experienced and something that you could sensitively inquire about? Perhaps just pause the video for a moment and call out some of your ideas about that. So what do you think? What did you come up with? What are some of the things that you felt were important? There's quite a few things in our presentation that would suggest that it's worth inquiring sensitively, it's worth building that trust. It's important to think about things like, is it a suitable time to ask? Is she in pain or tired or anxious right now? Do we have a safe place to be able to talk about this? Do we need to get into a safer, more private environment? It's important as well, especially in pregnancy, to explain clearly the medical procedures, to really take the time to talk through things and give her the time and space as you're doing medical procedures to be able to feel like she's in control of what's happening. It's also important to offer choices. It may be that she might have a preference around gender of the health practitioner. If at all possible, it's important to honour those responses. And aspects of clothing removal, touch, or those sorts of things, being flexible if you can around how to do those procedures would be, are often helpful and make a big difference to how people feel about their medical care and being able to move forward and actually take on the care that you're wanting to offer. So it's also important to think about, how would you start the conversation? What are some of the framing statements or questions that you might ask, some of the statements you might make to start helping Selma to feel safe to be able to inquire? So have a little think about that. Come up with a few framing statements that you feel like would be useful and would normalise the conversation so that Selma feels safe. So the key thing to think about is the way that you begin the conversation starts to create the environment, and then the way you ask questions ongoingly. Take her cues. If she doesn't want to talk about it any further, that's fine. And we're going to talk later about how you can offer some referral numbers and things like that, some information that might be useful for her, and it'll be up to her whether she takes that up. She'll let you know whether she wants to talk about it more. So, inquiring sensitively. If a patient does disclose sexual assault, it's important to respond in a supportive and respectful way, as we've talked about. You can ask about the safety and effects of the abuse, not the details of abuse. So you can talk about what kind of support they feel like they need, respecting they may not wish for any support right now, arrange what you can, offer the referral details, and that there's specialised help available. So you can let them know that that even though you might not be the person to talk about this in detail, that you can actually give her the numbers of specialised services and counsellors who will be able to talk to her more about it. Avoiding talking about the details actually protects the patient from re-traumatisation, and it protects you as well from hearing traumatic details. So you can encourage them by affirming you want to know what's happening to them, you want to be able to help and support them, and that you're not an expert and that you can link them with supports. It's important also that you don't make any judgments or assessments about how legitimate or real the sexual assault is or serious, because it's going to be really up to the patient themselves to define that. People often will minimise their own sexual assault, and they'll say, I don't think this is even sexual assault, or I'm not really sure. It's really important just to give them the space to be able to validate their experience, whatever their experience is, and then they can have choice and control about their health care no matter what their experiences are. So it's important to believe and validate whatever that is for them. So in responding respectfully, it's important to think, you might be the first person to have asked her about it. You might be the first person to have talked about, for her or him, to have disclosed their sexual assault. So it's important to remember you don't need to solve the problem, you don't need to convince her to go to any other services or ask detailed questions or explain what happened or why it happened or fix the problem. It's really about just listening, believing and offering choices. So here are some ideas of some ways that you can talk about these, how you can respond, things you can say. It's good to have a few ideas in your mind of, if you are faced with this, what are some of the things you could say so that you feel more comfortable. It's not always a comfortable thing to talk about. As health professionals, you obviously have a lot of experience talking about uncomfortable and intimate things, but this can be impacted by your own responses. So just to have some ideas in your mind and make sure that you're validating their responses, that you're believing them, and that you're relying on the indicators that you're seeing in them to know whether to start gently questioning and framing your responses. So even if we suspect that recent or past sexual assault has occurred, but the patient chooses not to disclose, we need to respect their right to privacy. Just asking is something that actually can really impact their healthcare and impact their capacity to disclose in future, because if they feel like they've had a safe and respectful response, that person will know that they're actually able to disclose at a time that feels right for them. So ask yourself, what deters you from having a conversation about sexual assault? And perhaps you might want to take a moment now just to have a think about that, write down a few of the things that make it difficult for you. I'm going to talk about a few of those aspects that we find make it difficult for health professionals to be able to talk about sexual assault. It can be that there's a lack of a private area to be able to talk about sensitive issues. There may not be a private consulting room. You may be in an emergency department or in a ward where you don't actually have a private space to talk about this. So it's important to think about, where is somewhere that I could take someone, or if there isn't somewhere I can take them, if their medical needs mean that they can't actually be moved somewhere else, is there a way that I can make the questioning or the way that we talk about this private or more general, or a way to sort of create a safe space for that person. There may be a lack of time. A lot of health professionals talk about very minimal time to be able to talk about these issues. So just work within your limits. And that's why it's important to think about it now and be prepared. Also, obviously, people have concerns about saying the wrong thing, making it worse for the patient. As long as you're responding in a respectful way, it's okay. You don't have to make it perfect. You don't have to say exactly the right thing. That person will know that you're coming from a caring place. People's own experiences can impact and their personal feelings about this. So it's important just to be managing those aspects within yourself, that you're getting the care and the support that you need to feel able to address these issues if they come up. And if you don't feel able to address it, then you can ask someone else to come and respond to those concerns. It's really important that as health professionals we respond to those indicators of family violence, whether it's yourself or somebody else. It's really important just to, the more experience that you have with practicing and educating yourself, that's going to build your confidence in approaching it sensitively. So don't be scared to talk it through with other people and even practice, do role plays, whatever's going to make you feel more comfortable to be able to respond to these issues in practice and in the moment. The first response to patients is actually the key. So it may be the first time that this person's ever responded. So it's important to think about what are the things that get in the way for you. Now we're just going to see a story about Lynette, and she's someone who talks about her experiences within a medical setting. So just to make you aware, some of Lynette's story might be potentially triggering for some viewers. So just to be aware of that and take care of yourself in any way that you need to, if that's something that that affects you in any way. And we're going to have an activity to follow.
I don't like doctors or other health professionals I only go when I absolutely have to. When I was a little girl, I used to get a lot of urine infections. I never told anyone, but my brother, who was a lot older than me, he used to take me into the shed and play with me. Play down there. Not normal stuff. At first it was nothing much, but then when I was about 9 years old, he started having sex with me, and it hurt. It really hurt. I think I had bruises, and sometimes I think I had tears. But I didn't tell anyone. He said it was our little secret. No one would believe me. You know, kids lie. That's when I started getting the urine infections. My mother took me around to lots of different doctors, and each doctor that I went to, I would hope that they would look and that they would see what was happening to me down there, the bruises and things. I would hope that they could stop this happening to me. But it didn't stop. Each doctor that I went to gave me a piece of paper for another urine test and tablets to stop the infection. But you know, no one ever looked at me. That's why I hate doctors. They made me hope.
So now that you've seen the video, let's think about some questions. What impact do you think Lynette's experience has had on her current engagement with health services? How might frontline clinicians have supported Lynette over time? And how could frontline clinicians support her going forward? Let's think about some of the ways that the health care setting may have impacted and helped Lynette as a child and through her health care throughout the years and now in the place that she's at now. It's important to remember that sensitive practice and a willingness to ask and be supportive is something that may radically change a patient's health and recovery going forward. Now we're going to talk about a trauma-informed approach. So as we talked about earlier, people who've been sexually assaulted have experienced a trauma. So this is something that impacts the body and impacts in many different ways. It impacts emotionally, physically, psychologically, even spiritually, and it's something that asks what has happened rather than what is wrong with you right now. So it takes into account a patient's whole well-being. Trauma-informed care understands that their experience of trauma, the patient's experience of trauma, can impact their engagement with healthcare. So it's really important to take a sensitive approach. If patients feel safe, they're more likely to disclose and receive the support that they want, that they need, and that you're wanting them to have. So considering, current and past trauma can actually impact a patient's ability to agree to procedures. It might impact in terms of their presentation at appointments. They may make choices that you might not understand about their care. So it's really important to think about how trauma may be impacting those and being able to create safety so that they feel able to take up the healthcare that's being offered in a way that they feel empowered about, that they feel in control about. So let's think about Selma. Considering her story, what do you notice about her? What would you like to follow up on? Let's take a moment to think about that. And now, if you were to apply a trauma-informed approach with working with Selma, what would you need to be thinking about? What are some of the ways that you can apply a trauma-informed approach to Selma's care? So did you think about safety? Were you thinking about safety? We've talked about that a lot, about trust and creating clarity and consistency and safe boundaries with Selma and maximising her choices and her sense of control, giving her options, collaborating with her around her healthcare and sharing the power between you and her in terms of what it is that she feels like she needs, and empowering. So why do you think that using a trauma-informed approach will actually assist patients like Selma to overcome those barriers that we talked about before? Take a moment to think about and talk about that. So hopefully you're pretty clear now that using a trauma-informed approach and creating safety and creating a space where people feel able to disclose if they feel ready, that will help to overcome some of those barriers, mainly the internalised sense of shame and the fear of medical and health authorities. We really want to start to change the way that health services respond to individuals so they feel like they can trust health services and be able to talk about sexual assault if they want to and get the support that they need. So just remembering it's not your role to fix the trauma or to fix the person, but just to be sensitive to the issues and the impacts and be able to refer them on to services that are going to be able to support them. So the aim of a frontline response. If a patient has disclosed family or sexual violence, or you see the clinical indicators that they may have experienced sexual assault, it's important to create that sense of control and safety so they're able to disclose when they feel ready. So caring for their emotional and practical needs, making it safe to talk if they wish, empowering them, exploring options with them, together with them, respecting their wishes if they decide that they don't actually want a procedure. If that's something that's really key to their healthcare, it may just take some more time to talk that through with them, or find some other ways to be able to talk about it so they feel like they've got some control. Helping them to find the social, physical and emotional support they need, and enhancing their safety in every way possible. It's important to talk about duty of care and mandatory reporting. Health professionals have a legal responsibility to report disclosed or suspected child abuse. So it's important to think about what is your hospital's duty of care policy, to be really aware of that and be really clear so that when you're in a situation, you know how to access support. Talking to your direct line manager, talking to police, talking to the Victorian Forensic Paediatric Medical Service. It's important to assess the patient's and others' current level of safety. If you believe that there is current risk to a patient or other safety, we really, really want you to refer, consult, get the support you need to be able to really uphold your duty of care in making sure children and young people are safe. There are mandatory reporting guidelines which you'll be able to access through your health service. If at all unsure, secondary consultation with your direct line manager, CASA, your local CASA, your social work department, and we're going to give you some referral numbers so that you know exactly who you can talk to about that. It's important to ask about safety as well to the patient, to the adult patient. Is anything like that going on now? Do you feel safe? Will you be safe when you leave here? And so that you can actually help to make sure that that person is feeling safe and they're leaving in a way that's safe. So talking about some referrals, the presenter will give out some handouts of the local numbers and information about local services that you need. Here's a list of some of the services that you can access and some of the local CASAs. There are centres against sexual assault across Victoria. There will be a local service that covers you wherever you are, whether that's a metropolitan or a rural area. Patients need to consent to a referral to CASA. Unless they're under 18, you can consult with them, but if at all possible, most CASAs like to have the patient's consent in terms of support, but you can still access a CASA even if that person's not ready to access that level of support. You can still talk to them for secondary consultation and debriefing. If the victim survivor chooses not to report to police, they're always able to do so in future. And also if they don't want to come to a CASA now, they're also able to do so in future. So you can give them the referral numbers and just let them know. They can contact a CASA at any time in the future if they want support. They will not have to tell their story. It's really just about getting support, and so we will talk them through all of that. All you need to do is really give them the numbers. So, key messages. Family violence often incorporates sexual assault. It's important to think about that family violence is an aspect of sexual assault. Most sexual assault happens within the family. Sexual assaults that happen within intimate partner violence there's often multiple occurrences of that, and multiple ways that sexual assault happens. So it can be repeated and ongoing within those relationships. So when someone presents with family violence, it's highly likely that they've experienced sexual assault as well. Many of people that you see in your practice, whether it's patients, their families, their children, have experienced sexual assault or sexual abuse within their lives. It could be a factor in their hospital presentation. So if you notice the signs, respond sensitively. Remember that people are experts in their well-being and safety, so working collaboratively with them is a sensitive approach, and in any way going to build trust in the medical setting. So it's going to help people to be able to access their self-care, their healthcare. Remember, you don't have to fix the problem. Always consult if you're unsure. People have choices about their body and health. So just remember to respond sensitively, access support if you need to, access debriefing if you need to, and if you feel like you need more information about this and more training, access more training, and make sure that you're as informed as you feel like you need to be able to talk about these sensitive issues with confidence. So let's take a moment of reflection. Just either by yourself to write down some things that stand out for you from the session today, or you may want to actually take a moment as a group to talk about this, or in pairs. So just decide based on your group what feels right for you. Take a moment to think about what stood out for you from today's session. What could you do in your work to support people to feel safer, comfortable and in control? And who might you access for support or to talk with after this session? And, thank you very much for listening. We really appreciate you taking the time to really think about these issues, and we feel like they're really important. We want to raise awareness of sexual assault in our society and hospitals' responses to family violence and their capacity to respond. So you as the frontline practitioner are that first person, and so we really value you listening and being able to think about how to respond and taking the time. There's also a clinical handbook, Healthcare for Women Subjected to Intimate Partner Violence or Sexual Violence, that you can access as another resource. So thank you very much and take care.